Nice.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Today, I'm presenting Dr. Lizelle Nagel. She graduated as a medical doctor in 2003 at the University of Pretoria and qualified as a pathologist in 2011. She worked within the National Health Laboratory Service until 2021. She has a keen interest in medical immunology and joined the Department of Immunology at AMPAT's National Reference Laboratory in Pretoria in 2022. Professionally, she provides countrywide clinical diagnostic support to clinicians in the fields of allergy, autoimmunity, and medical immunology. She is a member of the European Society of Immunodeficiencies and the Allergy Society of South Africa and is affiliated with the Inspire Focus Centre of Excellence in Clinical Immunology of the University of Pretoria. She participates in many educational activities to promote awareness of clinical immunology in South Africa, and her written work in the field has been published in the Journal of Clinical Allergy and Clinical Immunology. We're so fortunate to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I will be talking to you about vaccine testing today, and I hope the outcome of the talk will be useful for you in your clinical practice. I'm going to just cover some basic principles of vaccine testing. Then we're going to discuss 5 clinical cases to demonstrate the principles of the interpretation of the results. And then I'll just be ending off with a closing statement. So just to recap the diagnostic approach to inborn errors of immunity, the clinical history and the physical exam plays a very large part. It basically selects the patient that you want to take further for investigation. Immunology tests are expensive tests. And it's important to get specific clinical features so that you'll be able to make a diagnosis. The laboratory testing starts off with a full blood count and the differential count. You pay attention to the lymphocytes and the neutrophils, the different cell types on the full blood count. Then your basic immunoglobulins, which includes IgE. IgE is a biomarker of immune dysregulation, even more so than allergy. It's not a very sensitive or specific marker of allergy. The immunophenotype counts the different cells of the immune system, the CD4 positive T cells, the CD8 positive T cells, the B cells, and the NK cells. The B cell phenotype looks a bit at the different B cell subsets, such as class switch memory B cells and CD21 low B cells and transitional B cells. And the T cell phenotype looks at different T cells. And then we have our vaccine studies that we're going to be talking about. And then these T cell studies where you look at lymphocyte proliferation. So all these tests are basically used to establish a clinical phenotype. And once you have a phenotype and there's genetic testing available, you try to establish the genotype. For the number of IEIs that we now have genetic diagnosis for are growing, but you still have a lot of patients where genetic diagnosis cannot be established. In that case, you try to characterize the phenotype, the clinical phenotype as well as possible, and then you base your management then on the clinical phenotype. And once you've done all those things, then your treatment will then usually involve immune globulin replacement, prophylactic antimicrobials, hematological stem cell transplantation in patients where it is indicated, and then biological therapies to target specific signaling pathways and gene therapy. So that's just basically the diagnostic approach and the management. The clinical phenotype is very important in this. So why do we do vaccine testing, or what do we do when we do vaccine testing? We want to test the T-cell dependent and T-cell independent pathways of antibody production. So B cells respond to protein vaccines through the T cell dependent pathway and to polysaccharide vaccines through the T cell independent pathway. So tetanus toxoid is used to test the T cell dependent pathway, and we use Pneumovax 23 to test the T cell independent pathway. Conjugate vaccines are vaccines like Haemophilus influenza B and Prevnar 13. In a conjugate vaccine, you have a polysaccharide antigen that is complex to a carrier protein to improve its immunogenicity. So those vaccines elicit T cell dependent responses identical to protein vaccines. So we use tetanus, which is a potent immunogenic vaccine, to test the protein pathway, and we don't use conjugated vaccines for vaccine testing. At the most basic level, all you need to do vaccine testing is tetanus toxoid and Pneumovax 23. And this diagram describes the mechanism of action of protein vaccines. Your protein antigens are internalized by the B cells and it is processed. B cells and other antigen-presenting cells, such as dendritic cells and macrophages, they present those processed antigens to the CD4 positive T helper cells. The CD4 positive T helpers then consider the antigen that is presented to them, and then they deliver a co-stimulatory signal to the B cells through the CD40 receptor, CD40 ligand interaction. So it gives T cell assistance to make the B cell switch into a plasma cell that then will produce antigen-specific antibodies to that protein antigen. The characteristics of T cell dependent responses is that these responses are potent immunogenically. They cause the formation of strong memory responses that last for decades. And even when your antibody levels, your antibody titers have decreased to low levels, you still have that memory responses that exist for decades. So it enables long-lived antibody production, and that is why protein vaccines and conjugate vaccines are preferred for small children and infants, because they give you a much more stronger immunization response than polysaccharide vaccines. So polysaccharide vaccines interact with the B cell receptor on the B cells directly, and they initiate signaling cascades that will then give you the anti-polysaccharide response with antibodies specific to polysaccharide antigens. There's no T cell assistance involved. And the features of this type of immune response is it doesn't generate very strong memory. It is a short-lived, short-lasting memory. Most normal healthy people maintain the memory for about 2 to 5 years, but then within 5 years, then you get significant waning. So we do test waning responses when we assess the response to polysaccharide vaccines, and we consider it normal if you maintain that memory for at least 6 months. And if you lose that memory in shorter than 6 months, we consider it abnormal waning. Polysaccharide responsiveness is not tested in small children because you need time for this polysaccharide response to mature. So generally not in children less than 2 years. From 2 years, you can consider testing it. But in our experience, even for small children older than 2, it takes a while still to mature. So it's better to test from age 3 or 4. So in older children, it can take in some patients up to 7 to 10 years for the polysaccharide response to mature. So how do we perform vaccine testing? Most importantly, the patient must be clinically stable and he must be off interfering medications. There must be no steroids in the previous 4 to 6 weeks. Steroids potently suppress antibody production and memory responses. And if the patient has been taking immunoglobulin replacement, that must be stopped for at least 6 months, because there are antibodies and donor serums that are used to create these preparations. And the patient must also not have had a recent pneumovax vaccination in the past 5 years, because high levels of antipolysaccharide antibodies cause paradoxical inhibition. It's when you vaccinate a patient that has had a dose in the previous 5 years, the antigen in the tissues gets complex by the pre-existing antibodies, and it gets cleared before it can elicit an immune response. And the same also if the patient has had a recent pneumococcal infection. Pneumococcal antibodies are very reactive to exposure to pathogens, and if your antibodies are high at the time of the vaccination, it might cause a failed vaccine test for pneumovax. Okay, so you're going to collect your baseline blood samples at the time when the patient is off medications and clinically stable. And then you're going to look at those baseline results before you proceed to make sure that you get a good, valid baseline so that you don't get a failed vaccine test. And if you see that the patient has elevated values for many serotypes, it's better to just postpone the vaccination and repeat the baseline in 3 to 4 months. You want to do your vaccine study at a time when the patient is not responding to environmental exposures. So once you have a valid baseline, you then proceed with your vaccination with tetanus toxoid and pneumovax. You're going to test the peak antibody response 4 to 6 weeks after vaccination. That is the best time to test the peak response. You want to see if the patient can, at the very least, double his levels for against pneumovax 23. You must double your levels, your baseline values in 70% of the serotypes. And for protein vaccines like tetanus, you must get a 4-fold increase above the baseline. And if you miss that 4 to 6 weeks interval, no later than 8 weeks, you can still test up to 8 weeks, but no later than 8 weeks, the pneumococcal antibodies already start decreasing, and then you will not get a reliable estimate of the peak response. Okay, and then for polysaccharide response testing, it is necessary to test the trough level 6 months after vaccination to see if the patient has premature waning of polysaccharide memory. And this is not done for the protein vaccines, but it is required as part of the vaccine test for the polysaccharide response. There are guidelines for vaccine testing. We use the guidelines of the American Association of Asthma, Allergy and Immunology. This is an old guideline. There hasn't been updates since it was first published in 2012, and research is still needed to fine-tune the recommendations, but this is what we have to work with at this stage. There are basically five IEIs where the diagnosis depend on assessment of vaccine responses. It includes transient hypoglobulinemia of infancy, selective IgA deficiency, subclass deficiency, specific antibody deficiency, and hyper-IgM syndrome. So in these conditions, poor or normal vaccine responses form part of the diagnostic criteria. And then there are all, of course, other primary immune deficiencies, but secondary immune deficiencies as well, where that are associated with poor vaccine responses. We've mentioned that we don't test them in children less than 2 to 3 years of age. Some immunodeficiencies, such as SCID, are drastic conditions, and You don't need vaccine testing before starting treatment. Sometimes you have to give life-saving treatment. We generally define an adequate response to vaccination is attainment of protective levels for the polysaccharide response, and in adults, protective levels are considered 1.3 milligrams per ml per serotype or greater. Okay. It's important also to note that the higher your baseline levels, the less likely you are to get a significant increase. So that's the paradoxical inhibition that we are trying to avoid as much as possible. And then your polysaccharide non-responsiveness can also be classified into four clinical phenotypes. So these are your 4 response phenotypes. Your severe specific antibody deficiency are patients with less than 2 protective titers after vaccination. Your moderate severity is patients who are protective for 70% of the serotypes at baseline, but they fail to mount a doubling response in 70% of the serotypes. You can make a diagnosis of a mild deficiency if the patient is protective in 70% of the serotypes, but fail to make a 2-fold increase, and then your memory phenotype, where you lose the response within 6 months. So those are your 4 response phenotypes. Okay, so let's go on to our first case. I'm going to show you a normal vaccine response for this case. It's a 2-year-old boy that presented with allergies and snotty nose and frequent upper respiratory tract infections and febrile illnesses, but the child is actually gaining weight. He is thriving. The general practitioner just wanted to exclude immune deficiency. So you can see on the basic immune evaluation, IgA in M is normal, but we have a slight decrease in IgG normal subclasses. IgE is elevated, consistent with a child's allergies. He has mild MBL deficiency. If you look at the patient's infection profile, you will see that he gets frequent viral infections. He's had rhino and enterovirus and adenovirus on a few occasions and coronavirus. He gets antibiotics quite frequently. And on the microbacterial cultures, you can see there's Haemophilus influenzae and strep pneumoniae that tends to recur. Okay, so these are not unusual for a patient of this age. So children have a less developed immature response to polysaccharides. They do get more encapsulated infections than adults do, so that's not unusual. You can see his phagocytop and his food mix screens are positive, and there are positive allergy tests for grasses and for pet hair and for several food allergens. His lymphocyte immunophenotype is basically normal. Important, and when you look at his response to protein vaccines, you will see his baseline tetanus and diphtheria was 0.07, and a 4-fold increase would be an increase to 0.4 or greater, so he mounted more than a 4-fold increase to both vaccines. Okay, so tetanus and diphtheria toxoids are both protein vaccines. We prefer tetanus vaccine because it gives a stronger, more reliable stimulation of the protein response. And this is what the patient's Pneumovax response looked like. I'm going to go through it with you. We throw your eye on the baseline results. Just scan through them, see if you have any double-digit values for any of those values. We see there's only single-digit values. It looks good. It looks like the patient wasn't reactive to the environment at the time when the baseline was tested. Now we're going to look at the peak response, and we're going to see, we're going to count the number of serotypes that doubled from the baseline. So I'm going to count That's serotype 1, that's a doubling. Serotype 2, that's a doubling, that's 2. Serotype 3 didn't respond. Serotype 4 doubled. We're going to count them. That's 1, 2, 3. Let me see. 4 is 6B. 5, 6 or 9N. 7, 8, 9 for 11A. 12 if that's 10. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So this patient doubled his baseline values in 20 of the 23 serotypes. 20 is more than 70%. I think it's around 83%. Okay, and if you look then at the waning response at 6 months, we're just going to see how many serotypes did he lose protective immunity. So at 6 months, you're supposed to maintain protective immunity in at least half of the serotypes in this age group. The child is 2 years old. So he's lost protective immunity in 4 and in 5 and in 12F. So that's 3 serotypes. So 3 serotypes is about 20% or 15% of the total. So we can conclude that this patient has a normal memory response. There isn't premature waning. The definition of premature waning is a bit controversial. And you really need to correlate that with a clinical picture. The guidelines are very vague in how they define it. The guidelines define it as loss of protective immunity in a certain number of the serotypes, which can be half of the serotypes or which can be 70% of the serotypes. You have to evaluate that within conjunction with a clinical picture to decide if significant waning has occurred. Generally, if you lose protective immunity to 50 to 70% of your serotypes, we consider that as premature waning. So I've done, this is the calculations that we've just done. So the person had a normal response to tetanus. He had a normal response to the Pneumovax 23. Oh, it was 22 of the 23 serotypes. So he became protective in 96%. 20 doubled, that is 87%. Now I'm just going to take you another step further, and we're going to distinguish between the pure polysaccharide serotypes and the conjugate serotypes. So if you look at the profile, you're going to see that there are some serotypes that have a suffix star, and then the serotypes that don't have it. The serotypes that are marked with a star are the serotypes that are found only in Pneumovax 23. So these are serotypes that the patient has never before been exposed to. The only way you can be exposed to it is through natural exposure. The other serotypes are also covered by childhood Prevnar vaccination. The Prevnar vaccine is a conjugated vaccine, and it elicits T-cell dependent immune responses. So to those serotypes, you have a mixed T-cell, B-cell response if you do a Pneumovax study in a patient that has received Prevnar previously. So the pure polysaccharide serotypes marked with a star are unique to Pneumovax 23. So when you're dealing with borderline type of responses where it looks to you like the patient might have a deficiency, it's important to break it down further into the pure polysaccharide response and the conjugate response. So I calculated it for this patient. If you look at only the star serotypes, you see that the patient doubled in 10 of the 11, so that's 91%, meaning that he responded very well to 91% of the pure polysaccharide serotypes. And the conjugated serotypes, he responded to 10 of the 12, to 83%. So this corroborates the rest of the findings. This patient can respond effectively to both protein and pure polysaccharide serotypes. And he has maintained normal memory responses as well at 6 months. So this is an example of a normal vaccine response. So this patient, based on the fact that he had normal cell counts, he had a mild decrease in IgG, with normal vaccine responses, we can make a diagnosis of transient hypogammaglobulinemia of infancy. So this condition can be diagnosed after the age of 6 months when maternal transplacentally transferred immune globulins have decreased and the patient is making his own. And it generally normalizes by age 4. Sometimes it can take between 4 to 7 years to normalize. And it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So you manage these patients symptomatically, you manage the infections when they get it. You can consider short-term antibiotic prophylaxis to get the patients to a better spot while you're awaiting maturing of the polysaccharide response. So these patients require follow-up and repeat testing of the immunoglobulins and subclasses every year until they resolve or until they progress further into a actual primary immune deficiency. With our second case, I want to show you what happens to the results when you test a patient that had a recent infection at the time of the vaccine study. So this was a 3-year-old girl. She gets frequent upper respiratory tract infections, but she's gaining weight and thriving. There isn't any opportunistic or unusual infections or other red flags for immune deficiency, and so she was just routinely screened for immunodeficiency. Allergy workup was negative, immune globulins were normal, IgE slightly elevated, lymphocyte subclasses were normal, and NBL was normal. Our tetanus response indicated a normal result. We went from 0.09 to more than 0.4. That's a 4-fold increase above 0.1. And let's have a look now at the baseline NEMO results. If you just throw your eyes on the baseline, you can see there's a couple of double-digit serotypes. We don't like to see double digits on the baseline because the patient may be responding to an infection. And the higher your baseline levels, the less likely you're going to get an increase. So we're already concerned about the baseline. I marked for you with red dots the serotypes that have been compromised by recent infection. Let's see what happened to the peak response. We're going to count the number of serotypes that showed a doubling of the baseline. So serotype 1 is a doubling, serotype 2, serotype 3, 4 didn't respond. Okay, let's count. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 15 to 29. I'm going to count it as a doubling. Someone else may not. So there you can also see there's variation between the way that different people interpret vaccine testing results. So vaccine testing results are variable. There's lots of within and between subject factors and environmental factors that increases variability of the interpretation. And you need to keep that in mind. So that's 1, 2, 3 serotypes, 4 serotypes, 5 serotypes. I'm at 9N. Now, when we get to 9V, we had a 35 at baseline that went down to 10 on the peak. Okay, so that's a paradoxical inhibition. All right. And then serotype 10A didn't respond. We had another paradoxical inhibition at 11A. The 7.6 went down to 1.2. Then we had another response. Then we had another paradoxical inhibition for 15B. and 17F, where the peak values were lower than the baseline values. And then 20A, 22F was also paradoxical inhibition, and then 33F was also a paradoxical inhibition. Okay, so the occurrence of paradoxical inhibition is more likely the higher your baseline levels is, but it is serotype dependent and it is influenced by physiological factors. So it's difficult to say which serotypes will be more likely to produce a paradoxical inhibition when it is increased. So the patient showed a normal response to tetanus, but if you follow the interpretation protocol, you would think that the patient has a mild deficiency on pneumococcal testing. She became protective on 22 of the 23 serotypes, but she only doubled in 9 out of the 23 serotypes. So that is less than a 50% doubling. This patient, I think, is 3 years old. So in children less than 6, they need to achieve a 50% doubling. Okay, so we know that this patient has showed paradoxical increase in a paradoxical decrease in about 7 of the serotypes. 7 out of 23 is a lot of serotypes. That's at least a third of the results, and that is enough to compromise your interpretation of the vaccine response. So you're not going to be able to do a accurate assessment with these paradoxical inhibitions. If you look at only the polysaccharide serotypes, you see only 3 of them showed a doubling. So in a patient that has such limited polysaccharide responsiveness, you would expect a much more severe clinical picture. And the patient doesn't really show the clinical picture of a patient with encapsulated infections. It's basically a healthy child that is growing, and the PIDs were not very high on the list of probabilities. The doctor just wanted to exclude immune deficiency. And only 6 of the 12 conjugated serotypes doubled. So you can see that the paradoxical inhibition has caused problems for us with the interpretation of this vaccine study, and it was confirmed also when we looked back at the results on this patient. The patient did have a sputum culture that was positive for strep pneumo around the time that she had the pneumovax study. So we could conclude that this patient had an unreliable vaccine test due to a recent pneumococcal infection. So it's important to look at the baseline levels. I'm going to show you the baseline levels again. You want to see single digits as far as possible on your baseline sample. It's not a crisis if you see 2 or 3, maybe maximum 4 serotypes with a baseline or double-digit values. But if it's more than that, then you should be concerned. And it will be better to just rather repeat the baseline in 3 to 4 months and try to do your pneumovax study on a lower baseline. All right, our third case, now we have an adult patient. We have a 29-year-old HIV negative man that presented with persistently abnormal liver function tests. The patient was investigated by a gastroenterologist and primary sclerosing cholangitis was diagnosed. He also has chronic abdominal pain, abdominal symptoms, but celiac serology returned negative. And he had previous cholecystectomy for gallstones, and he also had an ERCP that in response to all the gallstones. So you can see on the routine biochemistry, we have persistent increases in ALK Phos and gamma GT over several months, out of proportion to the increases in transaminases. So this is a cholestatic pattern with secondary transaminitis. This patient also had chronic sinusitis for years that came up during the evaluation. The patient didn't particularly complain about it to the gastroenterologist, but he has been seeing an ENT surgeon for a number of years, and he has been taking several allergy medications that were not really helping much for the symptoms. And because of the chronic sinus symptoms, he's had an adenoidectomy and he's had sinus surgery done. On the adenoidectomy, the histology showed lymphoid hyperplasia, and during the course of his medical investigations, he's also had enteroscopies done, and on duodenal and terminal ileum histology, we also saw lymphoid hyperplasia. So when you see that these lymphoid abnormalities happening in different tissues simultaneously of the immune system, then you should take notice. So these are the lymphoid tissues of the immune system. You have your adenoids and your tonsils, you have your thymus, you have various lymph node groups and chains. You have the bone marrow where all your lymphoid precursor cells are produced. You have the spleen where a lot of the post-bone marrow maturation and differentiation takes place. The same also with your Peyer's patches in the small intestine and large intestine, and your mucosal associated lymphoid tissues, your mold tissues in the gut and in the lung. So if you start seeing lymphoid hyperplasia and proliferation, especially in more than one of these lymphoid sites, then you should take notice, because we have 5 clinical pillars that we consider when we evaluate patients for a possible inborn error. Is they can present with infections, or they can present with autoimmunity, autoinflammation, or with severe allergic disease or granulomatous disease, or with lymphoproliferation and malignancy. The malignancy is usually hematological malignancies and malignancies of the lymphoid organs. So when you see, especially when you see 2 or more of these 5 pillars occurring at the same time, then you must consider that there may be an underlying IEI present. So this patient was evaluated for a possible IEI. We saw on the basic bloods that he had IgA deficiency, but the others were normal. He also had a IgG subclass deficiency, and the results were confirmed on separate testing. So these are also significant findings. Because patients with multiple antibody deficiencies are at risk of progressing to more severe immunodeficiencies over time. So when the patient's lymphocyte subsets were tested, we saw basically normal T cells. There was a bit of CD4 lymphopenia on the day of testing, but otherwise B cells and NK cells normal, but we did see a reduction in the non-switch and the class-switched memory B cells. Okay, so that for us is also a red flag sign of a possible immune deficiency combined with the IgA deficiency and the IgG subclass deficiency. So we proceeded with evaluating vaccine responses. The tetanus vaccine, a 4-fold increase from 1.4 is an increase to more than 4. So it seems like this patient had a normal response to the tetanus vaccine. Let's evaluate his pneumococcal response. Let's just throw an eyeball on the baseline response. We see that we are noticing primarily single-digit values. We don't want to see too many double-digit values because we don't want a paradoxical inhibition. Okay, so the baseline looks valid. Let's have a look at the peak response. We're going to count the number of serotypes that doubled. That's 1. We have a paradoxical decrease on serotype 4. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's another paradoxical decrease. That's 2 paradoxical decreases, 17F. I've lost count a bit, but don't worry, we've done the calculations. We've had nice increases on 19A and 19F and 20A and 22F. Okay, so, and then at 6 months, let's see, at 6 months, he lost protective immunity to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 serotypes. So 6 out of 23, I think is between 20 and 40%, 20 to 30%. So we consider that normal memory for this patient, I think, if I counted correctly. So let's look at the maths that I did before. He had a normal response on the tetanus vaccine. On the pneumococcal response, he showed a mild decrease. 19 of the 23 serotypes became protective of the vaccination, but only 12 of the 23 doubled. So that's 52%. In adults, you need to show a doubling in around 70% of the serotypes. So this is the type of patient where you want to drill down and see what is the response to the pure polysaccharides and the response to the conjugated polysaccharides. So if you count the response to the star serotypes, you see he responded to 5 of the 11. That's less than 50%. Okay, so that is consistent with the clinical picture. The patient has chronic sinusitis and recurrent sinus infections. And if you look at the conjugated serotypes, 6 out of the 12, that's 50%. Okay, so this patient has definite impairment in his polysaccharide response, but it looks like also his conjugate response, but he still has a normal response to the tetanus. So that indicates these specific antibody deficiency, but of a less severe nature. More severe would be if the severity in the pneumococcal response is worse, and if there's also loss of the tetanus response. But the response, the ones that he responded to, he did maintain adequately at 6 months. Okay, so this patient has IgA deficiency, IgG subclass deficiency, specific antibody deficiency, and together with that, he has primary sclerosing cholangitis and unspecified inflammatory bowel disease and signs of lymphoid hyperplasia. So several of the clinical pillars of IEI are being met in this patient. So this is a type of patient that we want to monitor for evolving CVID. 5 to 10% of them may progress to CVID over time. And once the class switch memory B cells drop to below 2%, these patients have a high risk of autoimmunity, bronchiectasis, and granulomatous disease. I think this patient already had his class switch memory B cells of less than 2%. So this patient was diagnosed before Empath offered the B cell subset profile, the new B cells profile. But it would be interesting to do the B cell profile on him. An increase in your CD21 low population, that is an abnormal anergic B cell population that's associated with autoimmunity and lymphoproliferation. That is also an appropriate parameter to measure in patients with CVID. And they usually will also show a decrease in transitional B cells. Transitional B cells are the new naive B cells exiting the bone marrow on their way to the spleen for their final maturation and differentiation. And if they are decreased, that can also indicate a defect in B cell maturation, which happens in CVID. Okay, so for this type of patient, the management would then focus on the management of his autoimmune liver disease with immune suppressants or biologics as appropriate, and then close clinical follow-up for any new infections or complications relevant to CVID. You would like to repeat his FBC, immunoglobulins and his subclasses and his B cell phenotype yearly or every 2 years over the long term to monitor for evolution to CVID. And he will also have to be monitored for lymphoproliferative disease and cancer, especially hematological cancers. All right, so this was this case, and these are the criteria that you would consider to make a formal diagnosis of CVID. You need at least one of the following. That's your 5 clinical pillars that we've discussed, together with a decrease of IgG and IgA with or without low IgM, and poor responses to vaccines and low class switch memory B cells. So the patient has some of these criteria, but not yet all of them. Okay, and with the exclusion of secondary causes and no evidence of a profound T cell deficiency. So the T cell counts have to be normal on the subsets, and the T cell proliferation responses have to be normal. All right. So let's go on to our fourth case. Okay, so this is a CVID patient. This patient presented at the age of 56 years with progressively worsening malaise and jaundice and bleeding gums. He's a known hypertensive. He reports frequent sinopulmonary infection since the age of 20. So adult onset of infectious manifestations, but he's also a smoker. There wasn't really a significant family history. On clinical examination, there was jaundice and anemia and petechiae, but no hepatosplenomegaly or lymphadenopathy. On the basic full blood count, we had anemia, macrocytosis, reticulocytosis, thrombocytopenia, and a positive direct Coombs test with evidence of hemolysis. On his microbiological profile, you could see that the patient gets encapsulated infections in May 2017, and then again in August, and again in November and December, and again in March of the following year. It's always strep pneumoniae or Haemophilus influenza. So that is the type of profile that you see in patients with specific antibody deficiency. So this patient was diagnosed with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but he also had immune thrombocytopenia with it. The bone marrow investigation was normal. This combination of autoimmune hemolytic anemia with thrombocytopenia is known as Evans syndrome. And Evans syndrome is associated with IEIs, but also T-cell lymphomas and autoimmune lymphoproliferative disorders and SLEs. So all those other causes were excluded. So this patient was investigated further for an inborn error of immunity. So on his lymphocyte subsets, most subsets were normal except for the class switch and the non-switched memory B cells, which you know is one of the criteria for CVID. Immunoglobulins showed low IgA and IgG, so that is also part of the criteria. We had a poor response to tetanus toxoid. The 0.8 basically stayed where it was after vaccination. And when we look at his Pneumovax study, let's throw an eye on the baseline. We don't want to see any double-digit numbers or less than 3 or 4. We see we have a valid baseline. We see we have our peak response. We're going to count the number of serotypes that doubled on the peak response. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, I think I need to do that. And then, okay, so the peak response, he doubled in less than 70%, and it looks like he has reduced predictiveness as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Predictive on only 12 of the 23 serotypes. That's less than 70%. That's around 50%. And predictive on 50% with a doubling of less than 50%. Okay, so this patient has a moderate to severe specific antibody deficiency, and at 6 months, the little response that he did have was maintained in only 2 serotypes. So we lost protective immunity to 23 minus 2 to 21 serotypes. So this patient also has severe waning. So he's not reaching peak values and he's also not maintaining memory. So no response to tetanus toxoid with a severe specific antibody deficiency and premature waning. All right, so based on these criteria, CVID were diagnosed. So this was an example of a CVID patient that presented for the first time at the age of 56 with Evans syndrome. Okay. Genetic testing can be considered in CVID patients. About 20 to 30% of them demonstrate a mutation on genetic testing, but the yield is not very high. So generally, we don't really recommend genetic testing for CVID patients, but it can be pursued. Our last case is a patient with hyper-IgM syndrome. This patient presented at the age of 31 years with frequent sinopulmonary infections since childhood. So this history has been coming over many years from childhood. He had deafness in his 1 ear because of recurrent middle ear infections. There was a history of hypogammaglobulinemia, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis in childhood. So early history of autoimmunity as well. The infections are severe enough to interfere with daily life and not responding to conventional therapy. If you look at the immunoglobulins, you will immediately notice we have a high level of IgM together with low IgA and low IgG and low IgE. So this is the picture of a patient that can produce IgM, but he cannot class switch to any of the other immunoglobulin isotypes, not even IgE, and they're treating for allergy. Not that all allergy patients have elevated IgE. 60% of patients with allergy have normal IgE levels. Okay, so the patient also showed the typical microbiological profile of a patient with specific antibody deficiency. We have cultures from various sites, the throat, the ear, the sputum, always the same organisms, strep pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza, Moraxella catarrhalis. And if you look at the Pneumovax response and the tetanus response, he didn't respond to tetanus. The antibodies were undetectable on both occasions. And you can see with your bare eye, there's no serotypes that were protective on either the baseline or the peak response. Okay, so this patient, if I can take you back to this slide, the IgG is already extremely low, 1.1 grams per liter. Patients like these don't respond to vaccination. So you would not really gain anything by delaying therapy to do a vaccine response in a patient like this. You're justified to proceed with therapy for a patient like this. So for this patient, there was no response to polysaccharide or tetanus vaccine. The lymphocyte subsets indicated severely reduced class-switched and non-switch memory B cells. Remember, class switching work through the CD40 receptor, CD40 ligand interaction between B cells and T cells. B cells express the CD40 receptor. When T cells interact with the B cells with the presentation of the antigen and the T cell decides that reaction is warranted, it gives the co-stimulatory signal to the B cell by expressing CD40 ligand. And that co-stimulatory signal then induces class switching in the B cell, so it switches from producing IgM to producing the other isotypes. And if you have defects of CD40 receptor or CD40 ligand, then you can't induce class switching. So in this patient, CD40 ligand expression was absent and a diagnosis of X-linked hyper-IgM syndrome was confirmed. Okay, that is the end of our clinical cases. I'm just going to end off with a few comments. So you can see that vaccine testing is an important part of the immune evaluation because it assesses specific antibody function. Vaccine antigens are great for assessing immune function because it's a standardized antigen that is included in vaccines that's available anywhere in the world as part of the infectious disease management programs and preventative management programs. And the composition of vaccines are managed by regulation. So it's a standard vaccine dose that's produced under standard conditions. And so vaccine testing gives comparable results anywhere in the world that you perform it. Okay, so antibody production is also reactive, and that influences the success of your vaccine testing. You can get unsuccessful vaccine tests if you test it at a time when a patient is responding to outside influences. It also varies over time. You can get a patient when he's not responding with a good baseline, or you can catch him at a time when he's going up or he's coming down due to a recent infection. And all that will add variability in your interpretation. Some of the vaccine serotypes may drop out due to assay problems. We monitor for it when we look at the results. If it's 1 or 2, it doesn't matter. If it's more than that, then we contact you. We say we're having a problem with the result. We're going to repeat the result. The turnaround time is going to be delayed. You need to pay attention also to the number of paradoxical inhibitions that you see. And just judge the validity of your baseline before you proceed with testing. It's important to test the peak and the waning responses at the correct times. And if you miss those windows, then it won't be possible to go back and to fix it. Then you have an incomplete vaccine test. You can get failed vaccine tests due to loss of the cold chain and other issues. If something like that happens, you can look at the baseline result. You can decide to maybe give at least one more repeat dose if the patient's baseline levels are not very high. But you have to keep in mind that if you give too many doses within a 5-year period, then you run that risk of paradoxical inhibition. And then this is not an exact science, the interpretation. You can see how many factors are involved that contributes variability. A normal patient will respond to 50 to 70% of the vaccine serotype. So you need to correlate that with the clinical picture as well. And if you are too strict and too rigid with the cutoffs, you can have deserving patients that you withhold essential therapies from. Or you put patient in boxes where they're not really supposed to be, and you overdiagnose antibody deficiencies. So you, when you're looking at results, especially results that did not go the way that you thought it was going to go, you need to consider all the possible factors that could have caused variability in that result. And you have to be flexible and not overdiagnose. If you overdiagnose, you would say that many of your patients have a mild antibody deficiency. So you must be careful to avoid overdiagnosis. Immune globulin replacement should definitely be considered in patients with moderate to severe phenotypes. But even in a patient with a milder deficiency, immune globulin replacement may be indicated if the response to prophylactic antibiotics have been inadequate or there are other risk factors that makes this patient vulnerable to infections. Okay, so we've mentioned that our current guideline is already an old guideline and there hasn't been updates, and we definitely need some more research to refine the recommendations, as the existing guidelines are actually very. All right, this brings us to the end of this presentation. We can now take questions.
Thank you for your masterclass speaking. That was quite nice. Okay, so you actually have dealt very well with the vaccine testing. Now, for all the testing, you confirm what you already know. What then going forward? Does the patient need to have proper vaccinations with the conjugated, and then of course, like in the past, we know that you have to vaccinate the patient first with Prevnar, then you push with the Pneumovax. Now you go back to that square, and if that's the case, when do you do it? After 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months, or after a year? Because the teaching was that you cannot give Pneumovax, you cannot give Prevnar for the Pneumovax within a certain period of time. So can you guide us on that aspect?
Yeah. So according to the guidelines, for when you're giving Pneumovax for vaccine testing, then you shouldn't repeat doses within a 5-year period. Once you've given a dose, you must wait 5 years before you give another dose. So that applies to when you're using it as a vaccine test. Pneumovax has been recommended in the guidelines for the protection of older individuals and people with risk factors and secondary immunodeficiencies, but that is also recommended then as a booster once every 5 years. All right. But the thing with vaccines is that it's used to test the immune response, but it also has a boosting effect, which makes it useful for therapy as part of your management. So if you've investigated your patient, you've made a diagnosis, the patient may have a mild to a moderate deficiency, but he doesn't qualify for immunoglobulin replacement, or he's doing well on prophylactic antibiotics, you can consider giving a Prevnar booster. The guidelines recommend a Prevnar booster a year after the Pneumovax. All right. And then boosters for patients with risk factors should be at least every 3 to 5 years.
Okay. What about our patient that needs splenectomies, those who are probably got CNS leaks and all of them? Because ideally those you should be given a Prevnar after 8 weeks, Prevnar immediately, and then after 8 weeks. Because I think probably perhaps those are patients that are normal might not have immunodeficiency. But if you have those kind of emergency, would you give Prevnar?
Oh, I'm hearing what you're saying, doctor. You're talking about a patient that presents with an emergency condition now,
Yes.
and he may have had Pneumovax in the previous 5 years. The thing with Prevnar is a conjugate vaccine. So it will induce T cell memory, irrespective of what your B cell function is. Most people in today of people that received childhood Prevnar vaccination. Prevnar vaccine has been given several years in the past. So you can always give a Prevnar vaccination in an adult patient that presents with an emergency, irrespective of when the last vaccination was given.
I think that's very important, because I think also, again, you look at the adults who are born. I think if you look at the South African immunology vaccination, I think the Prevnar was started almost, I think, 10 years ago? Not long ago, yeah. So you look at the generations, those who are prior the advent of Prevnar 13. So it means somehow, because my understanding, the Prevnar is really to prime your immune system and improve your memory, and then Pneumovax is really to boost. And in the past, obviously, looking at, I think when I did my exam for pulmonology, we talk about 65 is the golden age, where you get vaccine before 65, then you must repeat after 65. That's still standing. The fellows writing exams.
Yeah, that is still standing, but the guidelines will probably change now that the 20 serotype conjugated pneumococcal vaccine is available.
From the Pfizer.
Yeah. So from what I've seen in what they're recommending for other countries, is that they're recommending the 20-valent pneumococcal vaccine for the routine protection of the elderly and people with risk factors now, if it's available, above Pneumovax. I'm not sure what our local condition is going to be. As far as I know, NICD is currently evaluating replacing the 13-valent one with a 7-valent Prevnar. I'm not sure if the 20-valent pneumococcal will become available for us.
I think we're still behind because I know I think in East well from Dubai, Arab world already it's available. It's only the global south that probably don't have it, but I think according to Pfizer, 6 months or so, we should be registered, and I think probably in December. Yeah, that's quite a very
Thank you for a great presentation and teaching. From your second case, I just wanted to know, does that mean you cannot do a pneumococcal response in a sick patient?
Not in a sick patient.
You'd rather avoid it.
You'd rather avoid because I think many mothers nowadays, they give Aspalone even before they see the GP. So by the time you have your sick patient presenting, there's a good chance that's already steroids been given that will suppress the response. And if it is a pneumococcal infection, it will influence the antibody production. We've seen that in some patients, we've seen pneumococ strep pneumo coming up on the cultures that were done at the time, but pneumococcus doesn't always grow. It depends on the other organisms that is also in the mix. It depends on the adequacy of the specimen. So even if you don't grow the pneumococcus on the culture that was taken at that time, it doesn't really exclude it. It can still be there. It is just missed. So considering all that uncertainty, it's better to just avoid that scenario entirely.
But also I think just a matter of comment, if you look, there are quite a few studies. One was done in Australia during the H1H3 pandemic, and also I think I did one here where we did during the COVID. So you have to be very careful actually when testing for immunoglobulin during the viral infection like Persian influenza, COVID-19. You can have a transient decrease in IgE subclass that normally recover after 6 weeks. So you have to be very careful and to interpret that with a caution. So again, I think maybe the take-home message should say that you don't test for them in the context of acute infection, because you have that transit, then that's normally influence the antibodies.
In immunology, you always confirm. You have always tested at least 2 or 3 times before you conclude. I've showed only single subsets, but for our CVID patients, the subsets are usually tested several times before we conclude that a patient meets the criteria or not.
The problem is the medical aid. Because I mean, we struggle even to get the serum immunoglobulins paid, And the other question I had to ask was that with in the vaccine response, for example, usually what I've done practically, unfortunately, is that we've told the patients, go to a baseline, then get your vaccine, because it takes about 6 weeks before you can measure the peak. This is possibly a patient who's already immunosuppressed and is on polygam, and I need to motivate for it at the next follow-up visit or something like that. So oftentimes I don't know what the initial immunoglobulin response, what the baseline is. And in your case, as you said, the paradoxical suppression. Mm-hmm. So in those cases, do you actually contact the clinician to inform them that, listen, there's it's probably labor intensive and it's probably not done unless there's a reflex, that you inform the clinician that, listen, these are double digits that we're seeing. It's not really going to be helpful, because we do write there, it's for vaccine response. So I only give them 1 paper. I don't give them 2 papers. I say this is for a vaccine response, to measure 6 weeks later. So is there some form to avoid this kind of paradoxical
At the moment, we only produce a standard comment.
Mm.
But we will be looking, we've implemented a new middleware solution with capabilities that our current laboratory information system doesn't have. We will be looking at refining our reports and producing a better personalized report going forward. It is better to look at the baseline before you administer the vaccine, because sometimes you do get an unpleasant surprise. It doesn't happen that often, but it can happen.
Yeah, it's just challenging when you have a patient that you're sending to Mpumalanga somewhere. They're going to do the testing. You'll probably not know what the result is unless it comes up on your, as an alert or whatever. So oftentimes you miss it and you don't want to delay it because they come from very far and they're dependent on you motivating
Yeah.
in time.
Yeah, so that is the problem with vaccine testing is oftentimes things happen and things don't turn out the way it is supposed to, and it all causes variability. So often you have to decide and make a clinical decision on whether you think the response is normal or abnormal. We've also noticed that medical aids tend to cause problems there. I believe it's not the place of a medical aid to interpret the results in the shoes of the clinician and to make to approve or decline payments based on their interpretation of the results. We believe that decision should remain with the clinician
Yes.
who has the full picture.
I think the issue, sooner, South Africa, we start having our own guidelines and have that strong voice. I think the medical aid will listen to us. The problem that most of the time we depend on the studies from overseas, and most of them not many people read them. And obviously the medical aid themselves also, they don't have a good advisors who actually try to advise them, that this is actually legitimate. So I think maybe we need to do more studies. We kind of need to be pushing. Doesn't mean that must become now, we must wave up white flags, but we must keep pushing. Change will happen. I think we just carry on. Thank you, guys. I think if we exceed our time, it's almost 8:10. Thank you. That was beautiful presentations. And I think we're really looking forward. I think maybe next time would be nice if you can take us through certain things like what called hyper IgE syndrome. I would like to really have that mostly. And yeah, do we have a rep? Can you call the reps? Because some